Welcome to the Caine Interviews. I'm Shannon Caine. On today's program, we'll be talking with the Fayetteville Freethinkers, Doug Kruger and Daryl Henschel. We'll be hearing counter-arguments to the right-wing Christian assertion that America was established as a Christian nation. We'll also talk about the true intentions of the Founding Fathers, the role of the Ten Commandments in the American legal system, school prayer, and much more. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
There are many people who feel that America is a Christian nation. Can you give us a few basic reasons why this assertion is untrue?
Yes. In fact, we have compiled what we consider the top 10 reasons that the United States is not a Christian nation. And let's go ahead and start with number one. First, the U.S. has no official religion. That right there takes care of the assertion that this is in some way officially a Christian nation. Some nations do have official religions. For example, in England, the Episcopal Church is the official church of England. That is called Church of England. There are other countries that have written in their constitution that they have an official religion, but the United States has no such thing. So the best case scenario for the assertion that the United States is a Christian nation is for someone to try to assert that unofficially it is, sort of by tacit consent by the people, or maybe by some appeal to the Founding Fathers or something like that, that unofficially this is a Christian nation. But as far as having an official religion, the United States is not a Christian nation. Okay, that's number one. Number two.
That's a good one. I was going to say.
Oh, you were going to say, yeah.
Because
well,
if the United States does not have an official religion, then it cannot be a Christian nation, by that definition.
Number two, separation of church and state is written in our laws. Now, it's true that the phrase separation of church and state is not in our Constitution, but it's considered a legal principle upon which the Supreme Court and other courts can rest their decisions, in the same way that, for example, the right to privacy is not in the Constitution. But that's now considered one of the premier legal principles upon which courts base their decisions. So separation of church and state is an accepted principle in U.S. law.
Right. Even though the phrase doesn't appear exactly like that, there's a lot of other principles that are implicitly stated that way. And that's, do we want to talk about where that is, the separation of church and state? I mean, that's the First Amendment, right?
Right, and in fact, that's why Judge Moore, some viewers may remember his fiasco a few months ago. He wanted to have the Ten Commandments displayed in the courthouse. In fact, he did have them displayed. And because of the separation of church and state, he had to remove his monument. And so Moore's Rock had to go.
Right, and he just, he's no longer allowed to be a judge now, too. That was just a recent thing, too. But the First Amendment, which says that no law respecting an establishment of religion, when Thomas Jefferson was asked, what does this mean? How are we to understand this? By the Danbury Baptists, he crafted a letter that's where the phrase occurs, that the result of the First Amendment, I've got the quote here, I could read the whole thing, but is that the effect of it is to establish a wall between church and state. And so that was his understanding of what it's meant. And the Supreme Court several times has specifically appealed to Jefferson's use of the words separation of church and state and interpreted it in the same way that he meant it.
So, in fact, the separation of church and state also, it's understood that this fits in well with the way in which the United States was founded, because it's part of the understanding of why so many people came to the United States, is that they have freedom, the freedom to practice whatever religion they want. And if the United States did have an official religion, I think you would find far fewer people coming here to the United States. So it's understood around the world that there is this separation of church and state here in the United States, and it's worked marvelously throughout the U.S. history.
If you look at the larger context of why they would craft a First Amendment like that, it makes perfect sense. There's many, many quotes where they were complaining about the atrocities that were occurring because of areas trying to have an establishment of religion, with the Puritans chopping off the ears and the noses if you weren't in the right denomination. And they didn't want that. They knew that was what was happening across the sea. Mm-hmm. So that's two.
Okay.
Keep going, Doug.
All right, number three.
Letterman's Top 10.
Right, yeah, unfortunately you won't see this on Letterman.
Well, it's not that funny. It's very serious.
But you can see it on the Caine interviews.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Number 3.
Laws promoting Christianity by the government are unconstitutional. So, as far as whether the United States is a Christian nation, if you can't support a specific religion, it makes no sense to say that the government somehow is of that religion. It's just an absurd claim. For example, if you want to, if someone were to pass a law saying that people have to say some Athanasian Creed or something like that in a school, in a public school, well, that would be struck down immediately.
Right.
So, is the U.S. a Christian nation? Well, obviously not, because it can't literally, according to our law, support Christianity.
Right. Prayer at football games. Another specific instance where they were making the separation between church and state. You can't have a school promoting a particular religion. And of course, the religious right are always trying to encroach upon that. They're trying to come into the schools and hand out Bibles, and, whenever they can. And there's this constant friction. But many mainstream denominations of Christianity understand that it's very much in their interest to have this strong wall separating, because then they can flourish and not have any kind of government encroachment. And I was going to mention the Lemon test, which is something the Supreme Court has repeatedly used to test the First Amendment, and it's got three prongs to it. Very simple. A law must have a secular purpose. 2, it must have a primary effect which neither advances nor inhibits religion, meaning governments to be neutral. Number 3, it must avoid excessive entanglement of church and state. So those are the tests. That's the Lemon test that's been used for several decades now by the Supreme Court to find out whether some law, or maybe if the Ten Commandments are being posted somewhere, that's a contentious one, of whether it should be allowed or not.
Okay, let's move to the next point.
Number 4.
Number 4 is the Constitution makes no reference to God at all, certainly not to Christianity. So the founding document of the United States, which is the Constitution, doesn't anywhere say that this is a Christian nation or that it's even a religious nation. It's a completely secular document. And unlike, sometimes people will, who are promoting the view that the U.S. is a Christian nation, will say, well, let's look at the Declaration of Independence. There it makes reference to God.
Yeah.
Well, but that's not the founding document of the United States. The United States was founded with the Constitution, and there's no reference anywhere about religion or about promoting religion or God. So, is America a Christian nation? It was founded as a secular nation.
If it was a Christian nation, how would they forget to include some reference to God in the Constitution? And you referenced the Declaration of Independence. Well, those references actually speak of nature's God, creator, and divine providence. Those are the words of a deist of that time. That's the phrases that they used. The Declaration of Independence never refers to Jesus or the Bible God, specifically.
Okay.
In fact, Darrell, that's a good lead-in to number 5.
All right.
Number 5 is the most prominent founding fathers were not Christians.
Yeah.
Now, this may come as a surprise to many people, because I have heard some Christian apologists, that is, defenders of the
Right.
Christian faith, state that people such as George Washington, Ben Franklin, or Thomas Paine even, were Christians. And in fact, sometimes this is used in solicitations for money. You'll see this on commercials, or you'll see this, some people put on programs about promoting the United States as a Christian nation. But in fact, the founding fathers were, at least the most prominent ones, not Christians. And for example, we got a number of quotations here. Let's start with, George Washington. George Washington was interesting in that as the first president of the United States, you would think that, well, gee, if this is a Christian nation, you're going to have a Christian for your president, right off. And in fact, he had a couple of terms. But nowhere in any of his extensive correspondence does Washington make reference to Jesus. And he doesn't even mention it. Okay, he doesn't come up. And this is in his private correspondence. If he were a Christian, a religious Christian man, you'd think that he'd be talking about Jesus at least sometimes. But nowhere does he mention him. And in fact, Washington would refuse to take the sacraments. He would go to church with his wife, Martha, and then when it was time for communion, he would get up and leave. Okay? He would get up and get out because he was not partaking of that. He was, in fact, a deist. Now, he didn't make a big deal about this. I mean,
He was very quiet about his beliefs.
Politics back then were probably not too dissimilar to what they are now, in that if he went around saying to everybody, hey, I'm a deist, he wouldn't have gotten elected.
Right.
But he was definitely a deist.
Okay, well, I may have some more questions about Washington later on. We'll go to your next point.
Yeah.
Okay.
We could probably do a whole show on just like one of the presidents,
Sure.
But it'd be very in-depth, more so than we need for this.
Number 6, the Founding Fathers did not intend to found the United States on the Christian religion. And this is clear from some of the comments that we find from some of the Founding Fathers. In fact, we have a statement by Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Dr. Thomas Cooper of February 10th, 1814. He says, Christianity neither is nor ever was part of the common law. It's not something that they intended, Christianity, to put into the Constitution, even implicitly. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself was even against having theology supported by the state. He said in a letter, October 7, 1814, a professorship of theology should have no place in our institution, speaking of the University of Virginia. So he didn't even want the state supporting teaching that as part of a program.
There's literally hundreds and hundreds of these quotations showing that they didn't want that.
Yeah, Ben Franklin was a professed deist, and he said early on in his life he was thinking about theology, and someone gave him a book arguing against deism, and he said that by reading that book, which is supposed to be refuting deism, he became a deist, because he said he realized that the arguments for deism were stronger than those against it. And he said that at that moment, and I think he was about 15 years old, he became a thoroughgoing deist, and he remained so for the rest of his life.
Okay. For the sake of time, we'll go ahead and get to the rest of the points.
Okay, let me just quickly go through. Number 7, biblical law does not coincide with U.S. law. If this is a Christian nation, then why don't we find the things in the Bible as part of U.S. law? In fact, some of the things that they do in the Bible are illegal according to U.S. law.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of the, for example, the 10 Commandments, only 2 of them can coincide with U.S. law: the thing against stealing and the one against killing.
Right.
But other than that, no adultery, or you can't, covet your neighbor's ass, or something like that.
Graven images.
Yeah, there's no law against coveting.
In fact, there's a challenge that someone puts forward, a Christian nation challenge. He says, here are some basic, essential aspects of the American legal system, and he challenges people to find some kind of biblical basis for these. Let me read through a couple of them. A government by officials elected by the governed.
Yeah, nobody gets elected in the Bible.
No.
Right.
A Republican democracy is totally against what we would have from the Bible. Separation of powers. There's none of that. A trial by a jury of one's peers. Where's the biblical basis for that idea? Presumption of innocence.
You sure don't get that in the Bible.
No, you're guilty of other people's sins.
Right, somebody else can do something, and it's your fault.
Freedom from cruel or unusual punishment. There's lots of examples of that.
Cruel punishments.
Yes. Freedom from involuntary self-incrimination. Pleading the fifth. I guess. Freedom of speech and assembly. That's nothing of that in the Bible. Prohibition of the establishment of religion. And the concept that the power to govern resides with the governed and is granted by them to elected officials. Paul specifically says in the New Testament that you're to obey the king. I mean, monarchy, America, the whole idea of America is totally against the idea of kings and the power from the top down.
Yeah.
We the people is supposed to be the idea.
Did you just mention the Bible, Darrell?
No.
Because here in 1 Peter, we find the statement, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men, live as free men, etc., etc. And then at the end of the paragraph, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. Now, if we were to honor the king, we wouldn't have a United States, because we wouldn't have had a Revolutionary War.
And that's what, 1 Peter?
That's 1 Peter...
No, 2 Peter.
1 Peter 2, 13 through 17.
There's 2.
Right, that's chapter 2 in 1 Peter. And then we also find in Romans Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. This is Romans 13 at the beginning. For there is no authority except that which God has established. And here's the statement. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. So again, if people were to follow the Bible, we wouldn't have a United States.
Okay.
And no free press either.
And no free
Okay,
press.
you're wanting
You
us
had a
to
real bell
go
again.
through
Okay.
the rest of them. Here's
Uh-huh.
the rest of them. Number 8, religious belief is not required for holding public office. In fact, it's illegal to have a religious test for public office. Number 9, official references to God in the U.S. motto and the Pledge of Allegiance, sometimes those are used as evidence that we're a Christian nation, only date back to the 1950s.
Okay.
Okay. This was with the McCarthyism and the anti-communist kind of sentiments. People thought, well, to keep the communists from coming over here, we'll have, God in our motto and so on. Now, some coins did have "In God We Trust" before the 1950s, but it wasn't officially mandated to put them on the money until the 50s.
Okay.
And then finally, in the United States, all religions are equally respected in the eyes of the law. So if we're a Christian nation, how come it is that you can't put a nativity scene up in a city, in front of the city hall, unless you also put emblems or things of other religions? Right?
Sure.
You can maybe put a part of a larger program, but it's not specifically selecting out Christianity and saying, we're promoting that. So those are our top 10 reasons.
There was a point on number 6 that I wanted to make with regard to the Treaty of Tripoli, and that's where a treaty that we had with a Muslim nation. It was put together under George Washington's time, but it was signed by John Adams, and it specifically stated, you couldn't put it more clearly, that the United States is not in any sense founded
Founded on the Christian religion.
Right. Yeah. Not in any sense. So, how that could be put any more clearly, I don't know. And signed by the president.
It was signed on June 10th, 1797.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned George Washington earlier. So let's talk about him for a moment. We all grew up seeing that famous print of George Washington on his knees in the snow praying at Valley Forge. School children were led to believe that he was the embodiment of the Christian American ideal. But how much of a traditional Christian was George Washington really?
But he wasn't a Christian,
No.
traditional or otherwise. And in fact, that whole Valley Forge thing is a total myth. That didn't happen.
It was put together by the same fellow who did the cherry chopping down the cherry tree.
Okay.
I mean, the mainstream scholarship in this area, there's no question. I mean,
Later on, when people wrote biographies of Washington, they wanted to glorify him in different ways. And one of the ways in which they did that was, I can't tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree, and so on. And also this Valley Forge thing. Total myth. In fact, the whole notion of the troops freezing at Valley Forge and suffering and so on, that's also fictitious. That didn't happen. But it certainly didn't happen that he stood there and prayed. That was something that nobody at the time or afterwards, nobody ever said anything about that taking place until people started writing these biographies scores of years later.
there's so many myths. We could just do a whole section on just these, because there's also prayer journals that are sometimes brought up, as if Washington had these private prayer journals that he wrote notes in, and they're totally bogus, but this still comes up once in a while. The Smithsonian rejected them well over 100 years ago, saying, there's so many reasons that they're bogus, but I could list a couple of them. Let's see. George Washington was a notoriously bad speller, and these are perfect. There's no spelling errors. And if you just read them, they sound like a Pentecostal minister, and just go on and on. It's just unbelievable that somebody who's familiar with Washington's material could think that he wrote these.
It's out of character, totally out of character.
Terrible.
And also, it's not written in his hand.
Right. Well, actually, I challenged the fellow who brought them up once to say, where are these? I mean, they should be on display in some museum or something. Nobody knows.
But museums won't take it.
No museum would have it.
Right.
No, they're bogus.
In fact, one might wonder about this Christian nation assertion that why is it that we're constantly finding fake quotations attributed to the founding fathers, when if they really were Christians and this really were a Christian nation, why would they have to be making things up? If something is the truth, if you have evidence of something, why would you have to make up evidence? Well, you wouldn't. You would just present what's there. Well, the fact is, just the fact that they make up evidence suggests that they don't have a case.
And they do it a lot. This is a real problem. There's a group called the Wall Builders. David Barton is the head of that group, and this was put out as a consumer alert This is when David Barton, who's been traveling the U.S. since the mid-'80s, doing these seminars and selling books and handing out pamphlets with bogus quotes on them. And he admits now that many of them are bogus. I mean, I've got a whole page here. These are the ones that he admits now. Some from George Washington. Here's a classic one. He attributes to George Washington, "It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible." That's one that's passed around a lot. Totally bogus. And he admits it now. And so he is, and the Wall Builders group I read their webpage today. They're totally devoted to tearing down the wall of separation of church and state, and devoted to teaching people that this is a Christian nation. That's their goal. And he's been selling all these books and doing these seminars, and so these quotes get picked up. Rush Limbaugh quoted a bunch of these bogus quotes in his big selling book. He's repeated them on the radio, and it just spreads and goes all over.
Another fellow who came here to, I believe it was Springdale a few years ago, to promote the Christian nation myth is a fellow named Herbert W. Titus, who in fact ran for president with the Taxpayer Party,
US
I believe it was.
Taxpayer
And so I went there to confront him because we knew that he was going to use a bunch of bogus quotations and assertions. And sure enough, he was talking about the Founding Fathers being Christians and so on. Afterwards, I went up to him and I told him, "Hey, how can you say that Washington was a Christian, or that Franklin was a Christian? These are known deists." And you know what his response about Franklin was? He said, "Well, on his deathbed, we don't know what was in his heart." So apparently, if we don't know what was in his heart, then you can just assert you do know what was in his heart, and that therefore he was a Christian.
So Doug said he was a deist. Where's your evidence that he somehow became a Christian? And of course he didn't have anything.
Yeah, and in fact, then he got mad at me for calling him on this, and he said, "Oh, well, you just have a stiff neck and a hard heart." So, but other than describing my anatomy, he didn't have anything of substance.
Okay, well, now Benjamin Franklin was a crucial player in the fight for American independence. Did his conceptual overview of liberty include freedom of religion?
Yes, freedom of religion, and certainly
Could that
freedom
include
from Christianity, because
freedom
he was not
from
Christian.
religion?
Yes, freedom from Christian religion. In fact, he said in a work, Toward the Mystery, "I have found Christian dogma unintelligible. Early in life, I absented myself from Christian assemblies." And his reasoning for thinking that government shouldn't support religion is basically that, well, look, if God is supporting it, what do you need the government to support it for? I mean, God's all powerful. Why would you need the government to help out? Right? He wrote in a letter to Richard Price, October 9th, 1780, "When a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it so that its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one." Okay, so just the fact that these people have to, who are promoting, for example, Christianity, have to try to get the government to support them, to Franklin that means, well, I guess you don't have God's support, which means I guess you don't have the true religion.
Okay, can you tell us a bit more about some of the other founding fathers and their religious viewpoints, or their lack thereof?
Right.
We would be delighted to. We have
we've already hit
plenty of
George Washington.
quotations.
Let's go down the list, I guess. George Washington, because really the first, I've got a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says, it's very embarrassing to those trying to show, I should have brought the exact quote because it's very short, but it says, it's very embarrassing to those trying to show that the United States is a Christian nation, the fact that the first 6 presidents, of them, not one was an Orthodox Christian. And a lot of people don't know that. They think that they all were Christians, which couldn't be more incorrect.
Well, John Adams in 1788 wrote a work called A Defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America. And he says the United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. Okay, he was a deist, the principles of nature. In the formation of the American government, it will never be pretended by any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods or in any degree under the influence of heaven. These governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. Our second president said that.
I had a debate with a fellow recently about John Adams in particular, and he read, there's a new book about John Adams that was very popular, and he read that book and he got all excited. He said John Adams was an on fire Christian or something. And I said, okay, you just read this book, provide me where did he say this? I mean, on fire Christian would typically be somebody who's talking about Jesus a lot. He couldn't find anything. There was one little quote about his wife saying her husband was a good Christian man, or something like that. But you have to notice that at that time, some dictionaries defined the word Christian as good. So you could just, he's a good Christian person. The words were sometimes kind of interchangeable.
That could just mean he didn't fool around or something like that.
Yeah, it's just like some dictionaries under atheist put wicked, when really it's not talking about theology.
Well, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is another one of the icons as far as the founding father is concerned. He's right there in the mix. He said about the virgin birth of Jesus. He said in a letter to John Adams, April 11th, 1823, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter." In other words, it's going to be relegated to myth,
right,
which is what he thought it was, and of course, which it is. Anyway.
He liked some of the teachings of Jesus. He took the New Testament and chopped out all the parts that he thought shouldn't be in there, the miracles and the superstition and
right. The Jefferson Bible, it's called.
Right, and had it distributed among Congress. And he said, some parts of the Bible are like diamonds, and picking out the good parts is like picking diamonds out of dung hills, because he thought a lot of the Bible was just, dung.
In a letter to Dr. Woods, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I have recently been examining all the known superstitions of the world." Notice he uses the word superstitions, "and do not find in our particular superstition, Christianity, one redeeming feature. They are all alike, founded upon fables and mythologies."
Yeah. There's Jefferson was a close friend of Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine is even more hardcore than Jefferson. But they had a lot of correspondence back and forth, and there are literally dozens and dozens of these quotes and they're not contested. It's not like these bogus ones. Where Jefferson just really separates himself from any kind of orthodox Christianity, even though he had respect for Jesus and for certain morals.
Right. Many of the deists thought that Jesus was a good moral teacher, and that he told people, for example, that they should give to the poor and they should, do kind to the least among them, and so on. And they thought those were good principles. But as far as virgin births or being God and so forth is concerned, the deists rejected that. They were against the notion that Christianity, as far as its dogma was concerned, it is true. Speaking of Thomas Paine, he was about as vehement and anti-Christian as you could ever see. And in fact, he said...
The first person to ever say the phrase United States of America.
Right. Well, he's well known for writing the book Common Sense, and in support of the Revolutionary War. But little known, at least among the general public, is that he wrote a book called The Age of Reason, in which he goes on a 200-page rant against Christianity and in support of deism. He was another deist. And he said of the Bible, "Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and tortuous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half of the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we call it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind." In fact, he thought that, as a deist, he thought there was a God, and he thought that Christianity was insulting to God. He said of the virgin birth story, he says, "What is it the New Testament teaches us? To believe that the Almighty committed debauchery with a woman engaged to be married, and the belief of this debauchery is called faith." So he thought, in fact, he also mentions in The Age of Reason, "Of all the systems of religion that ever were invented, there is none more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, and more contradictory in itself than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, and too inconsistent for practice, it renders the heart torpid and produces only atheists or fanatics."
Okay.
So, that's right.
Yeah, we really recommend reading The Age of Reason. It was written over 200 years ago. It's very readable. It's short. We sell copies at our booth for $5, and I like the old English flavor to it.
Oh, yeah.
And he said things about the Bible in there, showing many errors and mistakes and failed prophecies and anachronisms where things are out of order and messed up. And he just does it brilliantly. Things that still have not been responded to. Like the idea that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible.
Right.
He demolishes that. And there's still people that believe that today. They need to read Thomas Paine's book and try to deal with his arguments. He was in prison when he wrote a lot of that and didn't even have access to a Bible. He was doing it from his head. And then...
But he has extensive quotations, and they all turn out to be accurate.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a brilliant person.
Well, James Madison wrote in 1785 about whether or not the United States should have endorsed Christianity, for example. And he wrote in an address to the Virginia Assembly in 1785, "During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. So he definitely thought that endorsing Christianity legally in the United States would be a mistake.
Okay. Here's a question. How many of the founding fathers were fundamentalist Christians?
There were a few.
Although the word
exactly
fundamentalist,
That's a very recent.
but we know what you mean
invention.
by it. You know.
Yeah.
For example, Patrick Henry, who was famous for the "Give me liberty, give me death" thing, or "Give me death," he was a devout Christian. In fact, he said that the greatest thing that he could leave his children on his deathbed was that they would become Christians, and things like that. So there were a few folks. Other than Patrick Henry, I'm not so sure.
Well, see,
who
the
else we would include
biggies,
there.
we got the biggies on our side. I mean,
Yes.
all the big names that people associate with the real thinking and the founding and the early presidents, none of them, really. But
In fact, some of them not only weren't Christians, they hated Christianity, like Thomas Paine. And in fact, Ethan Allen, another hero, he's the fellow who took Fort Ticonderoga. When he was getting married, the preacher said in the course of the ceremony that he was going to live with Fanny Buchanan, his bride, agreeable to the laws of God. And Ethan Allen halted the ceremony and said, "Okay, let's get clear about what we're going to mean by God." And then he insisted that they define God as the God of nature, the deistic God. And then once that was agreed to, they proceeded.
Okay. Well, let's go to the settlement of this country. Weren't many of the American settlers attempting to escape state-sponsored religion in their former countries?
Yes. For example, that's why some of the folks came, the Pilgrims and so forth, came to the United States. Other people have come for the exact same reason. And so sometimes the argument is made, well, look, some of the early people that came here, the Puritans, were Christians, and so they were we were originally Christian, right? Of course, we had Native Americans before then, but I guess we're going to ignore that.
But they were coming around 1620, like when Plymouth was established, and the U.S. really wasn't put together with the Constitution until well over 100 years later. So
right, so it's not a good argument to say, well, since some Christians came here before other religions came here, that therefore this is a Christian nation. I mean, it just doesn't hold
in fact,
up.
they did such a bad job of it with all of their persecution that's kind of what set the foundation for the founders to say, look, when we let people have religious control over an area and chop ears off if you're not my denomination, this is what you get. We don't want this, so let's have a godless constitution. And
Okay. Well, do you think the Salem witch trials are a textbook example of what could happen, historically speaking, when secular law becomes mixed with religion?
Yes, I think that unfortunately that was sort of a continuation of some of the persecutions that have been going on in Europe for centuries. And in fact,
right, with Salem, only 17 people or so were killed.
20, I believe.
Relatively
20?
few people were put to death.
With Europe,
in Europe, there were tens
thousands.
of thousands. And in fact, I think I did an estimate one time. It was like 3 a day for centuries. Mostly women were put to death for being witches. And the standards, of course, once you start mixing religion and law, then sometimes you start mixing religious standards with legal standards, such as what would count as someone being a witch. Well, anybody with half a brain would have certain criteria that maybe you could observe, or hey, I saw somebody flying on a broom, right? But instead, you get these religious precepts, these religious tests, such as, well, I had a dream that somebody was a witch. Oh, well, that starts counting as evidence too. Okay, well, that's just absurd.
Right.
But,
Once you open the door to superstition, you no foundation. When there's some kind of communication with the other side, then it breaks down.
Let's look at the Pilgrims and the Puritans. What is the difference between those groups, and what are the myths that have been built up around them? Did the passengers of the Mayflower really come here to establish one nation under God?
Well, a Puritan is someone who is basically of a Calvinist denomination who came, and they landed at Plymouth Rock and all that good stuff. And a pilgrim is kind of a broader term. It didn't even come about until more than a century later that people started using the word pilgrim, and that's a little bit broader. That's just people who go on a voyage to find a new home. And so the Puritans came here, and were they here to found one nation under God? Well, they didn't found a nation, so the answer is no. I mean, they founded some colonies, and they brutalized people, and they put you in the stocks if you kiss your wife in public and things like that.
Maybe some of them wanted to, but if they did, they failed. They didn't come to the Constitutional Party and put it together, I guess. They went around.
You snooze, you lose.
There's another idea that's, and I meant to bring the quotes for it. There's this idea that around the time of the founding of the Constitution, that the United States was very religious, but it wasn't. And I've got at least 4 quotes, and those are that the United States at that time was very unchurched. Only like 5 to 10% of the population was attending a church. We're far more religious now than at that time. So.
Okay, well, let's look at the New York colony. There was an event called the Flushing Remonstrance, and that took place around 1657 in what is now present-day Flushing, New York. And all those who opposed the state-sponsored Dutch Reformed Church were forbidden to assemble publicly. There was open persecution of the Quakers and the Jews, and eventually it led to a revolt against the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, and the people claimed that citizens' liberties had been suppressed. And so in the end, Stuyvesant gave in, and it led to the first declaration of religious tolerance by ordinary citizens in America. So it was an early precedent for church-state separation. So in the instance of Flushing, New York, state-sponsored religion appeared to be dangerous to both the Christians and the non-Christians alike. Do you think a Christian theocracy such as was presented by the Dutch Reformed Church at that time would be equally dangerous if brought about today?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Any kind of theocracy. Whenever you have, the true idea of one nation under God, if you want that, look at Iran. Look at any country where the religious people have absolute power. Look at the Dark Ages, when the church had power and the atrocities that occurred. So absolutely.
In fact, that's one of the reasons that so many churches are against having a state-sponsored religion, because they know that it may sound like a good idea in theory, but it only sounds good if you're the one that gets to be the religion.
And when there's 20,000 denominations and sects and groups and that, you're probably not going to get to be the one necessarily.
Right, so in England, if you're with Church of England, you're probably doing all right, but if you're one of the other groups, then today things are somewhat more lenient, but there was a historical time when things would be rough for you. Why the Shakers came here. They escaped Anglican persecution in England. Speaking of continental Europe, in post-Reformation Europe, when the Catholics were in power, there was a widespread persecution of Protestants. But when the Protestants and Calvin and his people, when they later gained control, a lot of Catholics were martyred. There's at least 40 Roman Catholic saints that came out of that time from the Anglican and other Protestant counter-persecution.
Right, so, remember that Dr. Servetus, who happened to unfortunately end up in Calvin's Geneva, he had disagreed with Calvin on a couple of points of doctrine, like predestination and so on. And he ended up getting roasted alive. Right.
As a lot of people did. That was quite the fashionable thing back then. And a lot of people, you don't mess with Calvin. And so it just would seem to bring that over here would be absolutely anti-American.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's interesting how religion has flourished over here with the separation of church and state.
Sure.
Whereas you look at Europe, where they do have the established churches, and Christianity is in incredible decline. I mean, the numbers are just paltry, incredible, especially in the last decade or two. Even Germany now, almost half atheists now. The churches have
the
not
Archbishop
thrived.
of Canterbury in England said that the church attendance is dropping, and it's already so low that it is possible that within 50 years the Episcopal Church in England will disappear.
It's interesting that a liberal has become the Archbishop of Canterbury now. And I think that you have a lot of people on the rolls of the Anglican Church who will go to have their children christened. They'll go to be married, they'll go to be buried. But otherwise, you don't see them, and that's what happens, I think, with a lot of state-sponsored churches, the Scandinavian countries where Lutheranism is prominent. You have people that will do some of the big things, a wedding or whatever, and then
social clubs.
You don't see them. So,
we have a little bit of social clubs going on here too.
oh, well,
actually,
certainly, you know.
but it's not as much as there.
And,
I heard that in the Netherlands they were about 5 or 6 years ago selling churches for $1.
If you have a building, opening
Yeah,
a grocery
you don't
store.
want to be paying the taxes on this thing, and having nobody attend. It's not doing
I don't know. Do
anything.
they tax churches over there? I don't know.
Well, something was
I
going
think,
on. They had to.
yeah.
some kind
Well,
of-
maintenance alone can be expensive.
Oh, sure. And, well, let's go from historical America to something that's more in tune with present-day news. Now, we had been talking about the Ten Commandments, but there has been a lot of furor. It's Judge Moore, right? And he was displaying the Ten Commandments in a courtroom. And those in favor of posting the commandments publicly often cite their belief that the Founding Fathers would have wanted that way.
Or they say our laws are founded upon the Ten Commandments.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Is the American legal system based in any way on the Ten Commandments?
No.
No, we want to roast that one big time. We could do a show just on that. But let me mention something now, and I'll do it again at the end of the show. We'd like for people to be able to receive this little non-tract. It's called What's Wrong with the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
We also have this one here called Is America a Christian Nation? We'd like to send these to anybody who wants them free. If you just send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Fayetteville Freethinkers, 3633 East Huntsville Road, Fayetteville, Arkansas, 72701. Maybe we can put that up on the screen.
Okay, yeah, we'll put that up.
And that goes into depth, but we'll...
Yeah. Well, I've already mentioned that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1814 that Christianity neither is nor ever was part of the common law. And then if you look at the Old Testament, look at the Ten Commandments. Well, let's go through them one by one.
All
and
right.
see-
Just show how
Let's do it.
un-American they really are. Number one. Now, first of all, there's some controversy as to what are the Ten Commandments. I mean,
Okay.
Protestants have their version, Jews have a slightly different version, and Catholics have another slightly different version too. So if you're going to post the Ten Commandments, they're going to start arguing about which version gets put up.
By the way, I took a look at Moore's Rock that he had there, and I've never seen a version exactly like that. I mean,
Oh,
his,
really?
his 10th one was just, thou shalt not covet. And it didn't say what, whether it's your neighbor's wife or neighbor's
Oh, because
ass.
they have that whole clause, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ass.
Right, he just had...
He probably
Thou
didn't
shalt
want to
not
use a
covet,
bad word.
period. Yeah, he didn't want to, yeah.
So that's a problem there. Plus, we have a tract, which people are free to ask for, that says that probably all those versions are wrong, because there's a problem in the Bible where Moses got the first version, he threw them to destroy them, and then God gave them another version, and they're totally different, except for three. Three are the same.
Right,
7 of them are different.
the only version that's called the Ten Commandments occurs in Exodus 34. And in that one, thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Hence
baby
the kosher
goats.
laws.
Yeah.
So the
you shall
second
observe the
version-
Feast of Weeks, things like that.
The second version is the one that nobody uses.
But that's the one called the Ten Commandments in the Bible.
Right. So aside from all that problem, let's go with the close to the traditional version
Okay.
everybody uses. Number one would be have no gods before me.
Well, we don't see
Amendment.
that anywhere in U.S. law. There's
It
no
would
such
be
thing in
it'd
U.S.
be
law.
unconstitutional to say
Right.
that you have to have a specific god. It's
Uh-huh.
totally un-American.
No graven image, number 2. Well, there's no law against engraving or doing any other kind of image.
That's artwork.
As long as it's not pornography under certain conditions, you can do all the graven images you want.
We have a
It would
National
close down
Endowment
the
of the
Roman
Arts.
Catholic Church.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
you have statues of the Sacred Heart
Right.
and whatnot.
The irony is here is Judge Moore and these people fighting to have their graven image put in the government building. I mean,
Okay.
come on. You can't see the contradiction there.
Not take the Lord's name in vain. Well, you can take the Lord's name in vain as much as you want. There's no law against that.
That goes against free speech. That's
Right.
un-American.
Okay.
To make that a law.
Mhm.
Number 4, remember the Sabbath.
Keep it holy. Well, there's no law that says you have to keep the Sabbath holy.
And who's Sabbath?
And who is remembering the Sabbath anymore anyway?
Yeah, we got
Well-
laws that say you can't sell booze on Sunday, but
Well,
that's
that's
not
the wrong-
the Sabbath.
that's
That's
the
the wrong
wrong-
day. They missed.
Well, we have the Seventh-day Adventists
That's true.
Sabbath,
They
and
do.
we
They
have
do.
the various Sabbatarian groups, and
But-
of course the Jews.
Yeah,
And,
what's the Democratic fellow that's the Orthodox Jew? He was running for president. It doesn't matter.
Oh, the presidential
Lieberman.
candidate?
Lieberman.
Yeah.
He's an Orthodox. Now, you want to find out what you really have to do to observe the Sabbath correctly? I have a Jewish friend, and he went through and made me a list once of all the things that you have to do. Trust me, nobody except maybe extreme Orthodox Jews are honoring the Sabbath in the way it was
Yeah.
intended.
Well,
Maybe
but the
that
point
has
is, you
some
don't find any of
Hasidic-
that in law. Right? It doesn't
Right,
say you
it
can't
doesn't
work
occur in law.
on certain days.
And it's tough enough as it is, and so maybe some Hasidic guy in New York is observing the Sabbath, but the average human on the streets, because we can say that we observe the Sabbath by going down to East Tree Stump Baptist Church or whatever, but it's not quite the biblical observation.
Well, the main thing about the Sabbath was you weren't supposed to do any work, and yet we have
Which
people working on
includes
every
going
day of the week.
Which includes, now if you look at it from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, firing up your car to get there,
That's right.
And
I don't think you can flip a light switch.
You have
For some-
somebody called the
for some
Shabbos
people.
Goy that does that for you, and you have
But,
to hire somebody.
do we have our police officers and our fire departments taking a break on the Sabbath because they can't work? Well, no.
If you
And-
call 911 on Sunday, you'll get
Right.
somebody.
And the point is, if you did make a law requiring that you remember the Sabbath, it would be totally unconstitutional. So
They would be
that
struck down immediately.
Sure.
commandment
Why
too
most
is
places
un-American and illegal.
Don't have the blue laws anymore.
Right.
And
Exactly.
we do have the thing with liquor, but in
Well, some places do.
many
You can-
states they don't.
Right,
You
yeah.
know, Missouri, Texas, I think you can buy liquor. Just us.
And for sometimes it's on election day you can't buy liquor in some
Right.
states.
That could be helpful.
But that's not for
actually.
religious reasons.
You can buy liquor, it's just not at the liquor store.
Yeah.
Right? On
Well, that's
Sunday.
true.
Not
Go
at
to
the
a restaurant,
polls.
you can-
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, number 5, honor your father and mother.
Well,
There's
that's,
no law. It's a nice idea, but there's no law
It's
for
a
well,
it.
nice
actually,
idea.
just the opposite is true. You can divorce your parents according to U.S. law.
Well, yeah, supposing
Some
your,
people have done that.
supposing your parents were total bastards. Then,
Yeah,
Right.
it's
If your parent
Right.
is Ted Bundy, you don't want to
Yeah.
honor your your
Right.
father.
You can legally
Yeah.
divorce your parents in that they can no longer have a right to have you have contact with them.
Right.
So certainly then on U.S. law, it's not a requirement that you honor your father and mother.
And if it was, it would be unconstitutional.
Exactly.
Incidentally, the penalty in the Bible for going against most of these was the death penalty. And so if you did not honor your father and your mother, they could take you to the gates of the city and stone you. That's not something we're going to have anymore.
well,
Right. That's not in U.S. law either.
I wouldn't have
No.
survived my teenage years. You know.
Okay, number 6.
Thou shalt not
Not
kill.
Sometimes it's listed as kill, and sometimes it's listed as murder. There's different versions of that. And
There goes the army.
yeah.
If it's just killing.
Well, at least as
That's
far as
true.
killing innocent people, that we do have in U.S. law. But
Certainly.
it's not
Of course.
because of the Ten Commandments, because otherwise we would have had the other ones.
Well, murder is almost universally recognized as a bad kind of idea.
Right. Any organized, civilized society is going to have that. And why? Because people don't like to be murdered. So they get together and say, hey, that's the first law we need to do. Let's not get anybody...
Or, as civilized people, we don't go about murdering people, no matter how much they cheese us off in traffic.
And of course, notice that though in the Bible, in the very same book in which we find you shouldn't murder, people are told by God himself to go out and murder. Go out and kill people, kill everything that breathes, kill everything in the region to take their land. Right.
Yeah, repeatedly. Okay, number 7. Thou shalt not commit adultery.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's not illegal in the United States.
No, it
People
happens
do that all
every
the
day.
time, and there's no law against it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, and the next one?
Okay. Steal.
Don't steal.
Don't steal.
Now we do have that.
We
Yes,
do have that. So
and
we
it's
got
a good idea.
Again, good
2
idea.
out of 8 so far.
And it's a self-interested thing. People don't want to have their stuff stolen, so we make a law. And the idea of not having murder and not allowing stealing predate Moses. We know that from Babylonian texts.
Yeah.
and
Well, it's probably a bad idea to the cavemen. I mean, so, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll bonk you with the...
Yeah.
Do not bear false witness.
Well, that's not against the law, except in court.
I was gonna say,
commit
you can't perjure.
But as far as, can you lie? Well, sure, people lie all the time. It's not against the law.
In fact, it's socially sanctioned. We have little white lies without which, it's kind of the grease that moves keeps society moving along.
Politicians, how could they function if they couldn't fudge
Yeah.
what they're saying?
Right. So in some circumstances, you aren't allowed to lie, like in certain circumstances with regard to advertising. And with regard to testimony in court and things like that,
Right.
but
The
or
serious
contracts and stuff like that. But for the most part, you can go around lying all you wish.
Sure.
So that one is a good one, and it's a true one, but we don't need to appeal to an old document by Moses to figure out that we don't want to have people bear false witness.
Okay.
Number 10, covet. Don't
You shall
covet.
not covet your neighbor's wife, or sometimes added your neighbor's ass, his house, his property, and so on, or anything else that's your neighbor's. Well, there's no law against envy in the United States.
And how could there be? Coveting is the foundation of advertising.
It's the foundation of free enterprise.
Right.
Exactly.
Talk about un-American.
And
how would you possibly make a law against it?
Sure, how would Donald Trump have ever got ahead had he not coveted his neighbor's ass? And
Right.
So okay.
So we've got out of the 10, as we have listed here, 2 of them do happen to coincide with U.S. law, but the rest of them don't, and in fact would be un-American, would be illegal, would be unconstitutional.
Yeah.
So the notion that U.S. law is founded on the Ten Commandments is just ludicrous. It's just absurd.
Right.
People just haven't gotten the Ten Commandments before them, sat down, looked at them, and done any thinking with it.
Or maybe they go to church and they hear the Ten Commandments read, and this is the foundation of everything, and they don't. And you grow up hearing that, oh, 10 Commandments, yeah, and you don't really maybe think about it so much. And a lot of people just, it's one of those things like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree.
Right.
It's told you when you're in school, and this is a good idea.
Most people don't know the 10 Commandments either. Ask them if they can list the 10. It's supposed to be shorthand, nice rule of 10.
Well, and anyhow, if they're arguing that it's a Christian nation, Christ superseded the 10 Commandments with the one law of love. And
Right, that you should love God with all your heart and mind, and
sure,
so on.
and love your
Maximally
neighbor.
love God. And, well, loving your neighbor and loving God, neither of those are in U.S. law.
No, you don't have to do either of those things. And
Right.
so, okay, well, let's go back to history. And one overlooked facet of American history is anti-Catholic persecution. And for instance, as America was being settled, Roman Catholics were driven out of various towns and harassed, and that's a precedent that carried on for several centuries. And later there was gross intolerance of Irish Catholics, also the German Catholics. Later the KKK persecuted Catholics, and that went on until the 1920s or 30s or so. And then John F. Kennedy ran for president. Anti-Catholicism was brought right back into the open. And the persecution came almost entirely from other Christians. So it begs the question, if even the Christian denominations find it that difficult to cooperate with one another, what hope do you think it holds for state-sponsored Christianity?
Well, I don't think there could be state-sponsored Christianity without there being some serious problems, such as those you've described. Because once a particular denomination, for example, gets in there with power, with political power, they're going to want to say, we're the ones that have the correct answer, and everybody else is wrong. That just tends to happen when people are given power. And
Sure.
you can't have a generic kind of Christianity get into law, because some of them are so far removed from others that I don't think you could find a point of agreement with all of these different denominations.
Some Christians don't consider other people Christians that would say that they are. And what do we do with the Mormons? And
The Jehovah's Witnesses.
The Jehovah's Witnesses, and
In fact, I talked to some folks over at the Catholic Church in Springdale, and they told me that they're having to have apologetics classes for some of the children that attend the church, because they go to school there in Springdale, and the Protestant children are telling the Catholic children that they're going to go to hell
yes,
for being
And-
Catholic.
and that's quite common. It happens to Episcopal kids too.
Yes.
And the Episcopal kids tend to be fairly horrified by this because they don't hear such things in the pulpit, and it is kind of a big surprise. And because they get kind of accustomed to a more soft liberal approach, and then you're mixing with lots and lots of fundamentalist kids who are only parroting what their parents have told them, and I definitely saw it in action when I was a kid. The predominant religious group where I went to school was Pentecostal, and
They are parroting what their parents tell them, because children don't naturally hate other people. They have to be taught that by their parents, and so
Sure.
they're taught to say, okay, these people are bad, they're going to hell.
But you have, within the Christian groups, you have the ones that don't recognize the others, and you have groups that say that the anti-Trinitarians are not Christians. That lets out the United Pentecostal Church, which is a pretty massive group. They're not Trinitarians. Other Pentecostals are. UPC, which is what Elvis, his denomination. Now a few are, but on the whole, they are not Trinitarians. They're called Oneness Pentecostal, and they baptize only in the name of Jesus. They do not baptize Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And so they have a limited view or a non-existent view of Trinity. The Jehovah's Witnesses,
Unitarians,
Swedenborgians, Christadelphians, and
Right.
you have any number of groups that don't fall into that traditional Trinitarian pattern. And so you're I think a lot of people would be excluded. And then again, the groups you mentioned, what do we do with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and a lot of the other groups that just somehow have been historically marginalized. And so,
Whenever you bring religion forward into the public square and have in any way officially sanctioned, you get all this divisiveness. Look at what happens with school prayer. If you're going to have a prayer in school, who's going to get to conduct it?
and
I
I'm
was
gonna
raised as a Jehovah's Witness as a child, and they in Canada, and at that time they were doing the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
Well, there's a verse close to the Lord's Prayer that says, "Don't repeat your prayers like the heathens do."
Yes.
And so I had to go stand out in the hallway, and I couldn't be participant in that. So it divides people.
Nor as a Jehovah's Witness would you have been able to salute the flag, I would imagine, and or take any kind of oath, or to the things. They have the school prayers, and I know Jehovah's Witnesses can't do that, and so it is just an invitation to divisiveness, I think. Now, a lot of the current urging for America to get right with God is coming from the right-wing fundamentalist Protestants, whose influence has just grown dramatically in the nation in the past century. But aren't they actually something of an extremely vocal minority?
I agree.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Falwell's
I think it's from some
concept of
desperation too.
Yeah,
they're seeing their decline in societal power in some ways.
well, there are a lot of books have come out pointing out that the fundamentalists are actually theological Johnny-come-latelys. That fundamental, we think of it having gone back so far, but really late 1800s is when the ball really gets rolling, and
That's
then
true.
goes nuts from the 1920s to the present day.
And it was in response to the new liberal scholarship that was figuring out that Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, that the Bible is not inerrant, it has a lot of mistakes in it. And so they
That
said
the Gospels are anonymous, things like that.
Oh, sure,
so they said, let's come up with the fundamentals and let's say the Bible's inerrant and stick with that.
In fact, the doctrine of inerrancy, as it's used now in fundamentalist churches, also didn't come about until the mid to late 19th century.
So the fundamentalists may think that they're hearkening back to at least Luther and Calvin, but it's not even that, right?
Oh,
okay.
No.
And certainly not back to the 12 apostles, as so many of them claim. But in the 20s, I think, or even a bit before, you had Fosdick, and you had some of the other pastors who were coming out with the new scholarship. And so the whole thing is a backlash. And the more new scholarship you get, which is now kind of old stuff,
Yeah,
now
mainstream.
Now the current demon of the year is John Shelby Spong. And so Jack Spong writes these books that say, I don't believe in the resurrection. I don't believe in the virgin birth, but I'm still a priest. And so
He was the
In
high
fact,
people
he's-
don't know what to do with
He's
Bishop.
appealing to a larger and larger group of people that have been marginalized by the fundamentalist groups who have been overtaking Christianity and who have been politically influential. And in fact, one of his first really big seller was Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism. That was
Sure.
the name of the book. And in there he explains why, not only is fundamentalism based on very poor scholarship, and in fact, he likes to make the claim, I've met him a couple of times when he's come to speak here, he likes to make the claim that there aren't conservative and liberal scholars, there are only good scholars and bad scholars. And those that are the conservative ones are the bad ones, because they don't use methods accepted by historians. They use self-serving, special pleading type of methods. And so the notion that you have to believe that Jesus was really born of a virgin, or that you have to believe that Jesus was God, or that he rose bodily from the dead, that sort of thing, according to Spong, you don't have to believe those things to be a Christian.
Only to teach at Baylor University.
Yeah.
They had a great house cleaning at some point at Baylor, and they took polls, and if professors said that they didn't believe in the virgin birth, out they went.
There you go.
And I'm pretty sure that was Baylor that did that. And
Some
so
require that you sign a thing saying you won't advance and you're not learning and study these other things and change your beliefs. You have to stay with what you do.
Right. There's a certain, in some universities, you can even find online how there's still some statements in some universities where the professors, in order to be hired, have to sign on to a certain set of declarations.
Sure.
And they have to agree that if they renege on any of those or change their minds on any of those, that's grounds for being dismissed.
To my knowledge, that's not happening in the Catholic universities, but that's actually where some of your new scholarship is coming from the
Yeah,
Roman
some of the
Catholics and
Catholic
Anglicans.
Very
And it's not coming usually out of Jerkwater Bible College, someplace in the Midwest.
We could do a whole show sometime on the whoppers that people are regularly fed by their ministers in church. And the ministers should know better, because when they went to seminar, they learned, that there was
Seminary.
But remember how many fundamentalists are forbidden to attend seminary. Or they must go to
They have
seminary
special
of a
ones
certain.
just for them.
But a lot of I believe the Primitive Baptists still, and a lot of other groups of that ilk, they believe in an untrained ministry. It's an untrained, unpaid clergy, and so
with good reason.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to have them
'Cause if
ignorant
you're
if they're going to
trained-
believe this stuff.
Sure. Okay. Now let's go to prayer.
I thought they were all primitive.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, there's a special denomination of them, the Primitive
Yes.
Baptists.
The prayer.
And yeah, we're going to talk about prayer in the public schools again. So, all right, what in the world is wrong with asking a kid to bow his or her head for a few minutes and joining in a brief prayer? And do you object to the common Southern practice of saying prayers over a loudspeaker at school-sponsored athletic events?
Absolutely.
Well, for one thing, saying prayers at school-sponsored athletic events is illegal. So they aren't allowed to do that anymore.
With good reason.
There's
they
a lot of
changed
people
that
that
after
don't
I
know
got
that.
out of school.
Right.
I think some
yeah.
schools are still.
Some schools
doing
still
I
it.
bet
do
the
it,
one I graduated
but-
from still does
Yeah,
it.
yeah. There's a lot of schools that do not follow the law. In fact, Darrell has even seen some schools where they still bring in the Gideons into the school to hand out Bibles and things like that.
They did that when I was in school.
Yeah, but that's not allowed.
That was ages
They can't
ago.
do that.
So they're teaching kids how to go against the Supreme Court. That's not a very good lesson, is it? We have.
Obey Caesar.
Yeah, except when it goes against.
Yeah, Judge Moore was trying to teach people the same lesson, and look what it got him. He got fired.
Yes.
But yeah, having a child bow his or her head to say a prayer is harmful. And the way in which it's harmful, a lot of people say, well, what harm can it do? Well, it does a lot of harm. What it does is it's coercion. If there are some people in the classroom that do not agree with that prayer, and of course,
And there will be.
there certainly will be. If not now, it's certainly sometime in the near future with our multicultural America
More
now.
so in the future.
You'll find some students that feel the sense of coercion that they should now start believing what is being said in that prayer.
And
Well,
you'll
I
have the
think you
Mormons,
have
the
the-
Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Buddhists standing out in the hallway because they're not
With
allowed
a
to
feeling of
participate.
exclusion.
Exactly.
Because it can't be fun. I mean, and I was raised in an extremely orthodox religious type of household, and there's a lot that I couldn't do either. And you might as well take the kid, paint a big target on their back,
Yeah.
and it will make you the recipient of potential school ground violence.
And sometimes the teachers will make fun of them too. if they're-
Yeah, and it's, so I could see the ones who absolutely cannot, by their religion, participate in such things. A Muslim kid, it does make you a target.
There's a cartoon that goes, "Okay, class, we will now all bow our heads and pray, except for that godless heathen Johnny in the back row."
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
Well, that's the problem. The students that can't participate will feel like second-class citizens.
And they shouldn't be. Religion
Right.
should-
Well, some people claim that if America were meant to be a secular nation, we wouldn't have phrases like "in God we trust" on our currency, or "one nation under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. And can you explain the origin of these phrases in our coinage and our pledge?
Yes, that's a very important point.
Well, the one about the Pledge of Allegiance, under God was not originally in the pledge. Not many people know that because there's such a big deal about, oh, please don't take it out. But the fact is it wasn't in there to begin with. The pledge was originally as it is now, except for there was no under God. And that was put in 1954. And that was in the era of the McCarthyism and people being scared of communists. And by the way, I always find it amusing that McCarthy had all these trials and these witch hunts to look for communists. And the number of communists he exposed that were not already known to be communists was zero. Right? He had absolutely no success in finding any communists, and all he did was just make the United States look bad. But in any case, people wanted to keep communists from, secretly, I don't know, invading the U.S. or some kind of nonsense. So they put "Under God" in the pledge in 1954. The U.S. motto, "In God We Trust," was not the national motto until 1956. Now, it had appeared on some coins before that, and in fact, there are a number of pennies and 2-cent pieces that had it way back when, back in 1864. It was the first time "In God We Trust" appeared on a coin. But it wasn't officially the motto until 56, and then it wasn't until 57 that it started appearing in paper currency.
It's not a phrase that the founders would have even heard. It wasn't used back then. They came up with the national motto, E pluribus unum, which is inclusive, from the many one. Instead, in a weak moment in the 50s, under McCarthyism after the war, we felt that the Knights of Columbus pushed forward this idea, and it was made the national motto. And at the ceremony, the song that they played was "Onward, Christian Soldiers." So there's no, that's the background for that.
Okay, briefly, because we're running out of time now, what do you think is the greatest threat to American freedom today?
The greatest threat to American freedom? Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing that scares a lot of people is that because of the use of terrorism as a scare tactic, many people are willing to give up their freedoms these days. Their freedoms, their right to privacy. They're willing to give up, having the government spy on them or question them or look at their medical records and so forth. And unfortunately, that seems to be something that many people think you're a good American if you give up those rights to fight the terrorists. But really, it seems that the reverse is true. If you start giving up your rights, well, isn't that what America was supposed to be all about, that you have all these rights? It seems to me that if you give up these rights, the terrorists really do win.
There's a quote from James Madison, and I don't have it with me, but it was that if a country that you can keep in a perpetual state of war is a country in which you will not be able to protect freedom. And if we can somehow portray that terrorism is, George Orwell, where you have this perpetual state of war, it's just going to continue to erode freedom. So it's a balance.
Okay. All right. Well, we've been talking with Doug Kruger and Daryl Henschel, and you've been watching the Caine interviews. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.